Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this afternoon's presentation, The Bintel Brief, East European Jewish Immigrants and Their Descendants Make Their Way in America, 1906 to 1967, with Professor David H. Weinberg. We have a lot of exciting upcoming events that you can see on your screen right now. And if you wish to register for these events, please do so by visiting mishjewishhistory.org/calendar. Additionally, if you are enjoying our Zoom programming, we would love if you reached out to support us. To do so, please visit mishjewishhistory.org/donate. As I said this afternoon, we are very honored to have with us Professor David Weinberg of Wayne State and Bowling Green Universities. He's here to talk to us about Jewish immigrants and their settlement in the United States, as well as he has put together some interesting information on the settlement of those immigrants in our city of Detroit. Please keep in mind, if you have any questions at any time during the presentation, you can submit them via the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will take care of moderating a question and answer session after the professor's presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Weinberg.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Kara and the Jewish Historical Society of Michigan for inviting me to speak today. And before I begin, a few introductory comments. Earlier this year, I gave a lecture on the Bintel brief on this subject to the Shalom Aleichem Institute, and Kara asked me to present it again for members of the JHSM. But rather than simply repeating my comments, which centered exclusively on New York City, it seemed appropriate, given the audience today, that I include information on immigrant Jews in Detroit. And let me just, while I'm at this, let me just start my screen. And okay. Just a moment. Okay, can everyone see that? I hope.
It did not share yet.
Oh, it did not share. Well, I started the show. What am I doing?
You have to share your screen. Click on share screen.
Wait a minute.
At the bottom of your Zoom.
Just a moment. Just a moment. I'm going to have to start again. Okay, let me go to share screen. Okay, now we'll start again. Just a moment. Okay, slideshow. How does that look? Are we okay now?
It's still not sharing. The
No,
screen still isn't sharing. If you click on share screen.
I think I did that, but.
At the bottom of your Zoom.
I think I did that. Okay. Oh, and maybe I have to click on it?
Yeah, click on share screen.
Oh, share. Okay, maybe that's the
There we go. And now you just have to open up your presentation.
Wait. Yeah. I'm sorry for the delay. Okay. How about that?
Great.
Got it? Okay, I'm sorry about that. I apologize. I'm just barely getting into the 21st century. Well, as I said, rather than repeating my comments, given the audience today, I thought I would try to include information on immigrant Jews in Detroit. But my topic today is not really on the history of immigrant Jews in Detroit per se. That subject has been very well documented and covered by past scholars, including notably the late Sidney Bolkowski and Robert Rockaway, both of whom were native Detroiters and former colleagues of mine, as well as you can see on the right here in the photographic work by Irwin J. Cohen. As I'll explain in the first part of my remarks, the conditions of the first wave of East European Jewish immigrants in Detroit were somewhat better than those of Russian and Polish Jews living in New York City, largely because of three factors: the nature of their arrival, the smaller size of the population, and the greater economic opportunities afforded them. Nevertheless, the psychological challenges that first generation of Jewish immigrants faced wherever they lived were essentially the same. So too were the challenges facing their children and grandchildren. And ultimately, it's the commonality of the immigrant Jewish experience in America that I want to emphasize today. These challenges are evident in the letters to the editor column, or the so-called Bintel brief, literally bundle of letters, that appeared in the Yiddish newspaper, the Jewish Daily Forward. Although the paper was published in New York City, its scope was national. It was not uncommon, for example, to find correspondence from Jews in Detroit in its pages. Before looking at the letters, however, let me provide you with a brief overview of East European Jewish immigration to the US. In 1880, America had a population of about 50 million, of whom approximately 250,000, or 0.5%, were Jews. Over the course of the next half century, roughly between 1880 and 1924, the Jewish population would increase over tenfold, as almost 3 million Jews from Poland, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Romania would flee poverty and persecution to come to the New World. For the majority of these new immigrants, America seemed a dream. The wonderful tales about the United States had reached the remotest areas of Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe. For these largely Yiddish-speaking Jews, America was said to be the Golden Medina, the Golden Land, where men could make their fortunes and live happily, free from persecution and oppression. I've specially emphasized that, like the culture of the East European shtetl, this was a male-dominated vision. Nevertheless, as we shall see shortly, and then later in our examination of the letters, the challenges of settling into the new land were experienced by both men and women, albeit in differing ways. The dreams and tales that East European Jews heard about the new land and gave them courage and determination to set out for a country that spoke a language they had never heard and whose culture was dramatically different from the one that they were forced to leave. For those arriving in the New York City harbor, the Statue of Liberty only stimulated their imagination. Many believed that as soon as they disembarked, they would find heaven on earth. For most, however, whether they remained in New York or moved on to cities like Detroit, the reality proved dramatically different. They soon found out that no luxuries awaited them. They would have to struggle for the bare necessities of life. The majority of Jews from Eastern Europe in late 19th century and early 20th century settled on the Lower East Side of New York City. Only a few miles, ironically, only a few miles from the shore where they had disembarked. As many of you know, Detroit's answer to the Lower East Side was Hastings Street. Jewish immigrants actually arrived in Detroit only 3 months after their first arrival in New York. At its height around 1920, the Jewish ghetto, or Little Jerusalem as it was dubbed by outsiders, stretched from Gratiot to about where I-94 is today. By 1940, the area had seen a large influx of Blacks, most of whom had come to Detroit from the South to pursue labor possibilities created by World War I and the auto industry. In New York, the Jewish population grew from approximately 500,000 in 1900 to 1.5 million in 1914 to over 1,600,000 in 1920. Detroit's Jewish population was considerably smaller, as you can see, but grew even more rapidly percentage-wise. From 1,000 in 1880 to 10,000 in 1900, nearly 80% of Detroit Jewry, to about 14,000 by 1914. 34,000 by 1914. Most had been sent to Detroit by the Industrial Removal Office, or IRO, which was an immigrant agency in New York created by German Jews that sought to disperse newly arrived immigrant Jews throughout the country. Others came on their own because of increased economic opportunities in the Detroit area. Still others joined family and friends from the old country in what is known as chain migration. In New York, immigrants mostly lived in crowded tenements, such as this one. And there is, parenthetically, a wonderful museum called the Tenement Museum, which exists in the Lower East Side today. Obviously, its activity is somewhat curtailed due to COVID, but you can see it online, and they have a lot of very interesting information, including a lot of information about immigrant Jews. The fact that the Detroit Jewish population was considerably smaller and yet lived in an area that was almost the size of the Lower East Side meant that crowded conditions were less evident, at least in the early years. In the first 2 decades, immigrant Jews in Detroit often lived in single homes that had been abandoned by individuals who had moved to wealthier areas on the west side of Detroit. While a few more nicely appointed ones, many were run down and modest, such as this one near Elizabeth Street. And let me interject by saying that many of the photographs on Detroit that I will show today are courtesy of the Leonard N. Simons Jewish Community Archives. At the same time, the area lacked many of the amenities of Detroit's wealthier West Side. It rarely had running water. It had problems with lack of sewage. It did not have paved streets. Ultimately, the increased immigration after 1900 led to congestion and overcrowding in Detroit as well, and a general worsening in living conditions. Small houses soon gave way to apartment buildings that at times paralleled conditions in the Lower East Side in New York City. In addition, at times, housing often abutted factories, creating a situation of dire pollution. Here one can see the beginnings of the construction of newer apartment buildings alongside older single-family dwellings. Increasingly, especially near the city center, such as this, absentee landlords rented old tenements to poor immigrants. By 1911, Robert Rockaway notes, the Detroit Jewish Weekly could claim that the Jewish quarter contained tenement houses that are actually unfit to live in, old, decrepit, polluted, and infested. In New York City, immigrants soon discovered that the streets were not paved with gold. For many, daily life meant poverty, exploitation, disease, and often starvation. The situation was somewhat better in Detroit, though poverty was the norm for the majority of immigrants in the first decades after the 1880s. On the Lower East Side, jobs were scarce and working conditions were deplorable. Here are examples of notorious sweatshops where older immigrants often exploited the new arrivals. This was less true in Detroit, where Jews generally engaged in small trade and commerce, and where they and other immigrants were able to take advantage of the growing economy fueled by the auto industry. And here's some examples in the early 1900s of Jewish-owned stores in the Jewish ghetto, delicatessens, bakeries, dry goods stores, and the like. We tend to think of Detroit as a union town. But the reality was, at least in this period, workers, including Jewish immigrants, were too weak and too disorganized to fight against exploitative conditions. On the Lower East Side of New York City, families were often separated because husbands arrived first and worked to save money before bringing the family over. This was less true of Detroit, since the IRO generally ensured that the immigrants they send beyond New York City were married with families. Nevertheless, some families did stay behind in New York while awaiting their husband's financial situation to improve in Detroit. Yet wherever they settled, immigrants had to learn a new language and to acquire new skills. In New York, this was made more difficult, at least at times, by the attitudes of more established German Jewish families, who by then had moved to more fashionable areas of the city, such as Harlem and the Bronx. Though they were often supportive of philanthropic efforts on the Lower East Side, these so-called uptown Jews generally regarded their downtown co-religionists as an uncultured population whose behavior, belief, and mannerisms threatened to fuel anti-Semitism among the general public. For some, East European immigrants reminded them of the world they had actually left behind themselves in Europe. Similarly, in Detroit, older German Jews established medical clinics, day nurseries, classrooms, and free loan societies to service the newer arrivals. Like those in New York, their intentions were both humanitarian and pragmatic. They wished to aid their fellow Jews while at the same time ensuring that the new arrivals would remain largely invisible to the greater Detroit population. And here, probably well known to at least some of you, the Hannah Schloss Memorial Building, which was designed by Albert Kahn. It was built in 1903 to house the United Jewish Charities. The building was a precursor to the Jewish Community Center, and it housed a medical clinic, a day nursery, classrooms, the UJC office, and a Hebrew Free Loan Society, and even a bathing facility. For new arrivals from Eastern Europe, the hardships of life also were compounded by profound cultural shock. Whatever they may have felt about the shtetl, and despite all the romance that has grown up about the old world, the Alterheim, there were many who were happy to leave that world behind, which they regarded as stifling. Nevertheless, life in Eastern Europe had provided a certain security, a security of tradition, a stability of community. In America, of course, Jews had become hyphenated. Their loyalties to tradition and to American life caused conflicts and awkward compromises. There was the necessity of earning a living, which meant that many would have to dispense with traditional beliefs and practices. For the first time, they would be forced to work on Shabbat and holy days. At the same time, the freer atmosphere of America, which allowed for greater interaction with a larger society than they had known in Eastern Europe, led many men to shave their beards, to eat non-kosher food, and in some cases, in the absence of their wives or eligible Jewish women, to marry non-Jews. It is significant, for example, that few rabbis from Eastern Europe accompanied the immigrants to New York. The vast majority convinced that the New World offered very little in the way of religious learning and observance, while at the same time presenting more dangerous challenges to religious observance. While many immigrants may have thought of America as the Golden Medina, very observant Jews regarded it as the Treifa Medina. And I might mention just in passing, this is one of the reasons why the American Jewish community would eventually establish its own rabbinic seminaries. It did not see an influx of large numbers of rabbis from Europe. And I'm speaking obviously about Yeshiva University, the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and of course, Hebrew Union College. In Detroit, which did see a few Orthodox rabbis from Central and Eastern Europe at the turn of the century, the community nevertheless was deeply divided along ethnic and socioeconomic lines, especially in the early part of the 20th century. Excuse me. Despite many hardships, most immigrants never fully lost faith in the Golden Land. If they would not benefit from its opportunities, their children would. Despite reversals, most were determined to make this country their home. In any event, unlike most other immigrants, they had no place to return to, and that's important to keep in mind. The possibility of going back to Eastern Europe was simply unthinkable, given the political and economic hardships that they had experienced there and that had led them to leave in the first place. And that's a signal difference between Jews coming to America and other ethnic groups coming to America. Most other ethnic groups could return, and many did, to Ireland, to Italy, and so on. Jews, for the most part, did not, and overwhelming numbers did not. In the remaining time, I'd like to give you an opportunity to briefly share in the experiences of East European Jews and their descendants as they made their way in America by letting them speak for themselves. The selections I have chosen to use are taken from this marvelous collection of letters originally published in the Jewish Daily Forward, the most widely read Yiddish daily in America. Before we examine the letters, let's say a few things about the Jewish Daily Forward, which began as a weekly as noted here. This is the first issue of the Forward. From the 1880s to the early 1930s, the Forward, or Vorwärts, as you can see, those who can read Yiddish, or at least the Hebrew, was the most significant Yiddish newspaper published in the United States. Its circulation grew rapidly along with a massive influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe. By 1912, it claimed to have a circulation of 120,000. It reached the high point of some 275,000 in the late 20s and early 30s. Keep in mind, by the way, that the numbers are a bit deceptive because one paper was often passed around to be read by others, friends, family, neighbors, and so on. So its actual readership was probably even larger than that. And at one time, it was claimed to have the largest circulation of any paper in New York City. As I mentioned earlier, it was read and sold nationwide. And here we have an example of a newspaper cart in the Jewish ghetto in Detroit. Although we can't make out the specifics here, undoubtedly, at least some of those newspapers are the Forward. There was a very short-lived Yiddish newspaper I discovered in Detroit, lasted about 4 months in 1920, and then disappeared. I could find no other record of it. For much of the period, the Daily Forward was the major source of information for Yiddish-speaking Jews throughout the United States. They relied on it not only for news about the Jewish world, but also gaining some understanding of the world around them. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples of learning about or how the paper essentially apprised them what was going on in the world. One of the problems that the paper dealt with, which is kind of interesting, was the problem of so-called vanished men. That is, individuals come to America. I mentioned before that many of them came at least to New York as individuals hoping, or husbands hoping eventually to bring their families to the country once they had made enough money. But in many cases, or in some cases at least, these men simply vanished, having deserted their wives and children after coming to America. And this is a piece from the paper that's headlined, "A Gallery of Men Who Have Disappeared." And underneath it says, "If anyone knows where they live, please notify the Forward." My own sense is that this was somewhat less common in Detroit, where immigration was more tightly controlled by settlement agencies, and where, as I noted earlier, immigrants came with their families. Though undoubtedly there were instances where husbands preceded their family to Detroit, and instances as well where they disappeared. Another issue that's of kind of interest, and of course relates to women, and I'll come back to it in other contexts, is the support of women's rights. The Forwards was very insistent on this, and especially as you move into the early 20th century and the pressures exerted by suffragettes in America, the Forwards took a very leading role in countering what they believed, of course, to be the misogynistic or anti-women perspective of orthodoxy. Again, was the perspective they had. And here is an incident that has been covered in several articles, scholarly articles, a kosher meat strike that occurred in 1903 in New York City, which concerned the price gouging and also issues of quality of kosher meat. Some of you may know that kosher meat was subject to a community tax, and this was an additional issue. It was a way, of course, of raising money for the community and for the butchers themselves. And there was a very effective strike in 1903 in New York. The title here of the headline, or shall we say of the caption here, is "The Power of Women." And I discovered there was a similar clash that broke out in Detroit in 1910. So this was a nationwide issue. Women in Detroit ambushed meat wagons and threw meat into the street, raided butcher shops and the like, all in an effort to gain lower prices or to have lower prices. And in most cases, they were quite successful. And here another example that I thought was sort of interesting. 30 years later, in a somewhat more significant and somewhat more Americanized fashion, we have here the support by the forward of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is from 1940. Labor's choice in the elections and so on. Note, by the way, it's an issue I'll come back to in a moment, that this banner is both in Yiddish and in English, which tells you something about how the readership has changed over the course of 2 or 3 decades. Okay. Despite his strong socialist leanings and his suspicions of wealthy uptown Jews, the Forward's editor from its founding to 1946, Avraham CAHAN, was fervently convinced that immigrant Jews needed to integrate as quickly as possible into American life. And the newspaper was, and the culture around it were filled with all sorts of reflections of Americanism. Here's one that I particularly like. The Rules of Baseball Explained for the Non-Sportsman, which was published in 1909. Those who are baseball enthusiasts or not, this is actually the dimensions of the polo grounds, the old polo grounds in New York City. And there's a very, very involved discussion of the rules of the game. As you can see, it's also sketched out, third base and first base, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's another interesting reflection of CAHAN's emphasis upon the need for immigrants to become Americanized. This is a version which was published in the early 1900s of the Star-Spangled Banner. You'll notice that it's in, from left to right, in transliterated Yiddish, then in Yiddish, of course, and then most significantly in English, and always English on the right-hand side, which is the important side in this case. And this banner, or this flyer, supposedly hung in the Forward office for decades. At the same time, CAHAN was very well aware of the pull of the old world for immigrants. Though not especially sympathetic to religion per se, I mentioned that earlier, he saw the value of maintaining some sense of Jewishness among his readership. And this, of course, was his projection of the future of immigrant Jewish life, and indeed of Jewish life as a whole in America. His goal was to somehow combine the values of East European Jewry, what many of his contemporaries would call Yiddishkeit, with the new freedoms and opportunities offered by the immigrants' new homeland. It was a difficult and even perilous goal. As CAHAN himself noted about his readers in 1898, only a year after the establishment of the newspaper, quote, "It's just because they read the Yiddish newspapers that they are interested in the world outside of their own district and become ambitious to know in English in order to read the English papers. After they have learned that, they discard Yiddish altogether and read nothing but English." And again, I don't think he was speaking simply about language here. He was speaking obviously about culture. And that is indeed what happened in the narrow sense to the Forward. By the 1940s, the Forward was in decline as children of immigrants dispense with reading Yiddish papers. And again, I think we'll see a reflection of that issue of Yiddish in one of the letters that we'll be reading a little bit later. In 1983, after much inner turmoil within the editorial staff, the paper became a weekly with an English supplement. In 1990, the Forward decided to publish a weekly English edition, and some of you may be aware of this from your own experience. It soon became the most successful English paper on Jewish issues, with a circulation of about 30,000. At the same time, it had long since discarded CAHAN's socialist and anti-religious orientation, and is now generally supportive of what we might call liberal positions and normative Judaism. For a while, the Forward also published a Yiddish version as a bi-weekly, notice a bi-weekly, no longer daily, much less a weekly, with a readership of fewer than 7,000. In 1995, the Forward decided to publish a Russian bi-weekly for new Jewish immigrants. 10 years later, that edition was sold to a Russian language company. And actually, I must honestly say, I'm not sure if it exists anymore. The Yiddish edition does exist, but limps along. At the same time, the Forward's experiment in an English weekly was unable to sustain itself in print, and in 2019, the paper was transformed into an online publication. And here you have the Forward's website. Again, some of you might be familiar with it. In a sort of gesture to its tradition, this website also includes occasional articles, Yiddish articles with English translation. But let's return to the turn of the 20th century when the Forward was alive and well. As I mentioned earlier, to service his readers in 1897, CAHAN decided to publish an advice column for newcomers called a Bintel brief, literally a packet of letters, a column that survived until about 1970. And here's the masthead. Again, some of you may be able to read it. It says a Bintel brief. And this little notation underneath says, whomever sends a letter is requested to write on one side of the page only. Those were in the days when paper was very thin, and the poor editor could not read a two-sided letter. The letters that I've chosen today, which span the period from 1906 to 1967, are more personal. They faithfully reflect the transition from what one writer has called the world of our fathers and mothers, we might add, to our own world, or at least until the end of the Bintel brief in the early 1970s. A transition that brought great advancement in economic and social well-being and status, but also a certain loss of cultural heritage and commitments. Both the questions and answers that we'll be looking at reflect the challenge of finding a balance between the twin identities and commitments, a challenge that all American Jews continue to confront. And note the struggle can be found in both the letter writer and the respondent who shared CAHAN's desire to Americanize without dispensing with Yiddishkeit. So let's begin with two selections, one from 1911 and one from 1909 of the first Immigrants. And we've asked Risha Ring, the president of the Historical Society, to read those, please. Kara, can we have, hello?
Dear editor, a long, gloomy year, 365 days have gone by since I left home, and I'm alone on that lonely road of life. Oh, my poor dear parents, how saddened they were at my leaving. The leave taking, their seeing me on my way, was like a silent funeral. My mother and father wept for their son, then turned with heavy hearts to the empty house. They did not sit Shiva, even though they had lost a child. I came to America and became a painter. During the year that I have been here, I have had some good periods, but I'm not happy because I have no interest in anything. My homesickness and loneliness darken my life. Home, my beloved home. My heart is heavy for my parents whom I left behind. I want to run back, but I am powerless. I am a coward because I know that I have to serve under the Tsar for 3 years. I am lonely in my homesickness, and I beg you to be my counsel as to how to act.
Okay, we'll get to well, I'll go to this. The answer states that almost all immigrants yearn deeply for dear ones and home at first. The advice to this young man is that he must not consider going home, but try to make root here. He should try to overcome all these emotions and strive to make something of himself so that in time he will be able to bring his parents here. And here I just will parenthetically note two things. One, the pathos of the letters. The letters are often written in this very, very highly emotional state, which was typical of letters to the editor, but they also reflect, of course, the deep emotional anxiety that these people felt, which is one of the points I want to make about being torn between old world and new, in this case, very early. The second thing is that the answer, of course, also reflects the difficulty that the forward and that the respondent here has with trying to balance the two concerns. It's not appropriate for him to go back. He has to try to make something for himself. At the same time, it's perfectly understandable that he should yearn for the old world and for his parents. Sometime we can clarify it. The respondent says, or we can solve the problem by bringing his parents here. And here, a second letter from this early period.
Dear Mr. Editor, I was born in a small town in Russia, and until I was 17, I studied in Talmud Torahs and yeshivas. When I came to America, I changed quickly. I was influenced by the progressive newspapers and became a free thinker. But the nature of my feelings is remarkable. Every year, when the month of Elul rolls around, when the time of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur approaches, my heart grows heavy and sad. At that time, I cannot rest. I wander about through the streets, lost in thought, depressed. When I go past a synagogue during those days and hear a cantor.
Sorry about that. Let me go back.
When I hear a cantor chanting the melodies of the prayers, I become very gloomy, and my depression is so great that I cannot endure it. My memory goes back to my happy childhood years. I see clearly before me the small town, the fields, the little pond, and the woods around it. These emotions and these moods have become stronger over the years, and I decided to go to synagogue. Sitting in the synagogue amongst lunchlight and listening to the good cantor, I forgot my unhappy weekday life, the dirty shop, my boss, and my pale, sick wife and my children. All of my America with its hurry up life was forgotten. I am a member of the Progressive Party, and since I am known there as an outspoken free thinker, they began to criticize me for going to the synagogue. The members do not want to hear of my personal emotions, and they won't understand that there are people whose natures are such that memories of their childhood are sometimes stronger than their convictions. What is your opinion of this? Awaiting your answer, I remain your reader, SR.
And the answer, no one can tell another what to do with himself on Yom Kippur. If one is drawn to the synagogue, that is his choice. Every man has a right to live according to his beliefs. The pious man has as much right to his religion as the free thinker to his atheism. To parade one's acts that insult the religious feeling of the pious, especially on Yom Kippur, the day they hold most holy, is simply inhuman. Again, to go back just briefly to this, one sees again the pull of the old world, even in the case of a young man who is increasingly seduced by the new world and its openness, especially its free thinking nature, but he's still somehow torn. And it reminds me, if I could just include something parenthetically, my father used to tell me all the time that he knew of many people who, especially when they came to New York and elsewhere, who were complete atheists, who would have nothing to do with the synagogue, nothing to do with Judaism at all, but they were certain to go on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah to services, not for religious reasons, but because they wanted to listen to the great cantors. It reminded them, obviously, of the old world, and it also gave Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and by extension Judaism, a certain viability and a certain quality, much like an opera would have in the United States. Okay, and now we move to the first and second generation, and I think Bob is reading that, right? Bob
Yeah.
Kaplow, Rob Kaplow.
Worthy editor, I'm sure that the problem I'm writing about affects many Jewish homes. It deals with immigrant parents and their American-born children. My parents, who have been readers of your papers for years, came from Europe. They've been here in this country over 30 years, were married 28 years ago. They have 5 sons, and I'm one of them. We, the 5 brothers, always speak English to each other. Our parents know English too, but they speak only Yiddish, and not just among themselves, but to us too, and even to our American friends who come to visit us. We beg them not to speak Yiddish in the presence of our friends, since they can speak English, but they don't want to. It's a sort of stubbornness on their part, and a great deal of quarreling goes on between our parents and ourselves because of it. Imagine, even when we go with our father to buy something in a store on Fifth Avenue, New York, he insists on speaking Yiddish. If they talk Yiddish among themselves at home or to us, it's bad enough, but among strangers and Christians, is that nice? They want to keep only to their old ways and don't want to take up our new ways. We beg you, friend editor, to express your opinion on this question, and if possible, send us your answer in English because we can't read Yiddish. Accept our thanks for your answer, which we expect soon. Respectfully, I and the 4 brothers.
And the response, unfortunately, I'm having a little trouble. Let me just, okay. We see absolutely no crime in the parents speaking Yiddish to their sons. The Yiddish language is dear to them, and they want to speak in that language to their children and all who understand it. I'm sorry? It may also be that they are ashamed to speak their imperfect English among strangers, so they prefer to use their mother tongue. But it would certainly not be wrong if the parents were to speak English too to the children. People should and must learn the language of their country. Okay, I just want to get back to, okay, just a second. Okay, there again, you see, trying to have the cake and eat it, and notice also significantly the drop off in Yiddish. They no longer can speak, or at least can no longer write Yiddish, don't understand it at all, and more importantly, have no desire to learn it. They're ashamed of, to be with their parents who continue to speak Yiddish in public. Okay, all right. Where are but Rob, are you also the next one? I'm not sure. 1928.
I am.
That's
Dee Dee Ostrich.
Dee Ouster. I'm sorry.
That's
I got
okay.
your name and I missed it. Okay, so I've got, wait a minute. Let's go back. Okay. There we go, 1933. Nope, that one's been done, 1928. Go ahead.
Okay, we're there. I consider myself a progressive woman who thinks that there should be no difference between Jews and Christians. Years ago, when I was a girl, and sometimes heard that parents would not allow their children to marry a Christian, I maintained that they should not interfere. Now, however, when my daughter has fallen in love with a Gentile, I have become one of those mothers who interferes because I am against this match. I am not one of those fanatic parents who warn their children that they will disown them because of it. But I am trying with goodness to influence my daughter to break up with this boy. I don't know how to explain it. He is intelligent, quiet, and gentle, but somehow his nature and his way of thinking are different from that of a Jew. His parents are American Yankees, never miss a Sunday at church, and speak with reverence of President Coolidge. When one is young and in love, one is in the clouds and sees no flaws. But when love cools down,
I'm sorry, I did that.
okay, she
Okay.
will see it's no good. I see it in advance. True, it could happen that she could marry a Jewish man and after the wedding will not be able to stand him. But with a Jew, it's still different. I would very much like to hear your opinion about this. Respectfully, a mother.
Great, great letter. Comment, you yourself answered everything in your letter, and our opinion is the same as yours. Your daughter should also understand that the match is not a good one, but she is infatuated with the young man, and when one is in love, then all the sensible arguments are worthless. What's interesting here, again, to note, she no longer knows, that is the mother, no longer really knows what being Jewish is. It's a kind of a feeling. She doesn't know what it is. She can't explain why this daughter should marry a Jew, but somehow she feels it's the right thing to do. At the same time, she wants to be open to America, as do the editor, or as does the editor, who says that when one is in love, all sensible arguments are worthless. That is an American notion. You would not find that notion, even if you remember the schmaltzy songs of Fiddler on the Roof, you would not find love described quite that way in Eastern Europe. But in any event, that's a fascinating letter. And now we move on to the fourth generation. Kara, I think you're reading this one, right?
I am. Dear editor, I have often read the Bintel brief to learn how you have suggested solutions for problems of your readers. Now I would like to tell you my problem. It is difficult for me to write Yiddish, so I am writing to you in English. I am a young man, 26 years of age. My grandparents brought a precious heritage of Yiddishkeit from Eastern Europe. I remember the good Jewish life they lived. I still remember how they used to sing Jewish songs, speak Yiddish, and prepare delicious kosher meals for my parents and me on Friday evenings. They were the best days I have yet known. However, several years ago, my grandparents passed away. My parents and I now reside in the suburbs in an area which lacks the Jewish traditions and customs that I knew as a child. Very few except the older Jewish people in my neighborhood speak Yiddish. Few keep strictly kosher homes. Few people observe our wonderful Sabbath in the traditional manner. Most of the young ladies I meet are not the type of Jewish girl I would like. I feel like a stranger among the Jewish girls who are interested only in rock and roll and wear miniskirts. I long for the days I knew as a young boy. Many aspects of life in this area seem to snuff out whatever remains of our beloved Yiddishkeit. I want to know how my family and I can perpetuate our traditions. I would also like to know where I can find people of my age to share my interests. Sincerely, S.T.
And the response, which obviously delights the hearts of the editor. Blessed be the grandmothers and grandfathers who brought with them to this country the spiritual values of generations deeply rooted in Jewish life. A great many of their American children and grandchildren did not show any interest in upholding and continuing this rich spiritual heritage. That you do not now have the Jewish atmosphere you long for is in great part the fault of your parents, because they did not carry on the same tradition of your grandparents. Had they brought you up in the tradition of your grandfather, you would now have a circle of friends in which you could live as you desire. And again, you see the return, an individual with keeping it in the 60s, of course, an individual who longs for some substance, which he calls Yiddishkeit. I don't think he knows exactly what it means, and yet he doesn't have the tools. Notice that the unsaid or unspoken comment, which is spoken by the editor, is that it's your parents' fault, that they rushed to assimilate, and in assimilating, they had thrown away the great traditions of their own parents. So, okay, and that is the fate of immigrant Jews, first, second, third, and now fourth generation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Weinberg. As I said before you started, any questions, comments can be submitted via the chat feature. I know that we got a couple that did come in during your talk, so I'll just start with those.
Okay.
This is from one of our viewers. Jews came to other Michigan cities too from Eastern Europe. My Zaidi moved to Kalamazoo in 1903, leaving the family in the Tsar's empire. Kalamazoo was his destination because a successful landsman was there. My bubby and family followed in 1905. My bubby's sister and family stayed in Kalamazoo, but my bubby and Zaidi family moved to Detroit in about 1912 so that she could work at Shabas. He owned a shoe repair shop on Hastings and Winder, a couple of blocks from their apartment on Winder and Beaubien.
Okay, well, I don't know if it calls for a response of sorts. The only thing I would say is obviously I was speaking mainly about Detroit. Of course, there are many other experiences of Jews moving beyond Detroit, other parts of Michigan. The challenges were even greater there. You will notice in this comment, if I might say, one of the reasons for going is chain migration. That is, parents had gone, or grandparents in this case, and then parents followed and so on. And that was very common in these circumstances. Also, again, I'm sort of drawing from what I hear. Economic opportunities were obviously somewhat greater, and so there is this move back to Detroit. But again, I'm fully aware of the fact that there were Jewish communities throughout the state. I know that Muskegon, for example, has one of the oldest Jewish communities in Michigan, one of the oldest synagogues in Michigan. So there are other stories here, and I know that the Historical Society has investigated them and will continue to investigate them.
Are there any other questions that anyone has? If so, please submit them via the chat feature. I don't see any other questions coming through. So again, thank you, Professor Weinberg, for your presentation today. It was really wonderful, and we really appreciated the knowledge that you shared with us about how this topic impacted people in Detroit and impacted probably many of our ancestors. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate everybody participating in our Zoom programming, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Oh, a question just came in.
Okay.
Can you name some of the early rabbis who did come to Detroit?
I did have some information on them. I don't have it readily at hand. Again, it's not my expertise. I would suggest that you take a look at Bob Rockaway's book that I put up on, let me see if can I go back to it? No, I don't know. Bob Rockaway has a whole discussion of early religious life and talks about one or two rabbis of significance. And I apologize for not being able to grab those names for you. But if you look at Robert Rockaway's book, Jewish Life in Detroit, I think it's called, it's, I'm sure, available in the Detroit area at any public library. You'll be able to find that information out.
Well, thank you again, Professor Weinberg. Thank you, everybody, again for attending. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon on our Zoom programming. And we really appreciated you lecturing for us today. Thank you.
Very good. I enjoyed the way.
Bye-bye.
Keep well, everybody. Bye-bye.